Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We are honored to have the incredible, fascinating, and accomplished Jane McGonigal, who is a person who has dedicated her life to solving some of the world's biggest challenges through games and future forecasting. Jane is the Director of Games Research and Development at the Institute for the Future, the world's leading future education and forecasting organization. She also teaches at Stanford, a course called How to Think Like a Futurist. And I know many of you have taken her Coursera courses or listened to her TED Talks. And she is a person who believes that we can tackle some of the world's most complex problems, such as climate change, poverty, hunger, and actually pandemics, where she spent a lot of time in the early years, long before we were all talking about it, through games, simulations, and forecasting. And she also has this deep belief, I think, that we can make our lives, our individual lives better, to find more agency in our life and an ability to navigate a complex and constantly changing world through games and through thinking about the future in the right way. Not only does she find this in her work, she has personal experience with it. In 2009, Jane suffered a debilitating concussion that left her despondent, and rather than simply suffer, as many of us would, she turned to her work and designed a game called Jane the Concussion Slayer, a nod at the time to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And day by day, week by week, it helped her get better. And that game is now a game called Super Better, which is being used by more than 1 million people. It's one of the most downloaded apps in the App Store. And it helps change people's lives to get through post-traumatic situations, to alleviate depression and anxiety. But not only is she the designer of Super Better, she's designed games for all sorts of organizations, the International Olympic Committee, the World Bank, and many multinational corporations such as Microsoft, Intel, Nike, and McDonald's. She is a person who has been named by the World Economic Forum as one of the top young global leaders, by Fast Company as one of the 100 most creative individuals in business. And she is, of course, a best-selling author of a number of books, including Reality is Broken about games, Super Better about the aforementioned Super Better, and her latest book, Imaginable, about thinking about the future. So we're really excited to have you, Jane. Thank you for being here.
Oh, David, thank you so much. That was such a kind introduction. I'm very excited to be here today.
So, you start with what I think is or I want to start with was, I think, one of the most provocative and maybe basic ideas that you present, which is this idea that games can be a force for good. A lot of people's prior view is that games are maybe a hobby at best, and sometimes, you know, a distraction from being in the real world, or a social tax. And you know, people often don't talk about World of Warcraft or Halo or games more generally in a positive light. So tell us how you think about sort of games and their transformative power.
Yes. So this is a topic I've been studying for more than 20 years. I was actually lucky enough to start my PhD studies in the very year that the field of game studies was founded, when a bunch of researchers and scientists said, you know, hundreds of millions of people are spending a lot of time with this new technology. Maybe we should understand it better, and the social impacts, the psychological impacts, the cognitive impacts. So I was right there early on the scene. And my interest as a researcher was how playing games seemed to change players' self-perception of their own skills and abilities, and change the way that they would tackle not just challenges in the game, but also in their everyday lives. And I wanted to figure out if there were certain types of games that we might be able to design, or game mechanics that were more effective at bringing out some really positive psychological responses, like resilience in the face of setbacks, the ability to learn faster from failure. One of the most fascinating data points that we discovered early in the field of game studies was that gamers spend 80% of the time failing when they play their favorite games, which is astonishing, right? To think, like, I mean, if you spend 80% of the time failing at work or at school, you would be despondent, give up, go home. But there's something about entering into the state of gameful play, where we're willing to work hard at things that are intentionally difficult for us, right? Every game is designed to be frustrating, to require us to learn new skills and try different strategies and ask others for help. And putting ourselves in that, essentially, it is a psychological position of vulnerability, right? We have to accept the first time we pick up a golf club or log into Fortnite that, it's going to be challenging. And through our own efforts and attention, we will have to get better, and through our willingness to ask for help. And that is I think the single most replicated finding from my own work and from the field of game studies, that people who spend a lot of time playing video games in particular, because of how they are constantly ratcheting up the challenge so that we're always, in a sense, struggling, always, in a sense, being required to learn and grow, that those individuals do develop a kind of constitutional willingness to do hard things and develop a set of strategies for being able to learn and improve even under stressful conditions. And so for me, that was the good news that I wanted to document in the scientific literature, help researchers who were doing fMRI studies understand what they were seeing in the brain. I'll say the last thing I'll just sort of drop that I think, everybody who plays games or has a loved one who plays games should understand is that there's essentially a kind of neurological circuitry that gets strengthened when we play games that are hard for us, which is essentially the neurocircuitry of hope that we can get better. And that transfers outside of the game when we are learning a new skill at work or tackling a difficult subject in school or trying to achieve a long-term personal goal. That ability of the brain to stay engaged with difficult challenges and look for evidence that we're making progress, that there's someone who can help, that we're getting better, that a hyper awareness of how we can get better is really the signature experience of gaming.
Right. It's amazing. It really sort of trains all these virtues that you talk about, especially with kids, right? About resilience and learning to fail. And we, oddly, we don't think we have ways, people talk about kids being too protected nowadays, but it's in some sense the very opposite. It builds those very virtues that we're trying to create. You have quite a unique background. I mean, you alluded to it, but you're probably the only professional futurist, game designer. It wasn't even a field of study. I mean, I think you were when you were doing your work at Berkeley, you were the first person to even do this. You also have a PhD in performance studies. How and you spend obviously a lot of time, in future as what you might think of as future theory broadly. How do you see all these, these interests and your personal work historically overlapping and coming together and intersecting to kind of create this synthesis that you found in your work today?
Well, so early in my research career, I was getting so excited by what I was seeing in my research that I didn't want to just study games. I wanted to roll up my sleeves and get in the game industry and help developers figure out how to, can we just tweak the games a little bit to really maximize these benefits? And so I started working as a professional game developer and going to conferences and giving talks and sharing the science and essentially trying to start a movement, start a really innovative change in the field. And what I discovered after I'd gotten a little bit of traction with that is, essentially I was recruited to become a futurist because it turns out that the most successful futurists often start out as people who are already envisioning a very different future from what exists today. And they're out there trying to get other people excited and trying to really deeply understand, what are the technological foundations that would make this possible, the scientific foundations, the cultural shifts, and really developing that long-term strategy to change the world we live in. And so I was lucky enough to be contacted by the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto. And, they said, well, come hang out with us. You're already essentially making the future. Let's teach you some formal foresight methodologies and tools for how professional futurists, think about changing systems and changing the world, and maybe we'll come up with something useful. And the useful thing that we came up with was realizing that gamer skills are very well aligned with the skills you need to anticipate hard to predict or hard to prepare for futures, that gamers could actually use that same creativity and flexibility and thinking and willingness to engage with things that are hard to look at difficult futures like possible new pandemics or extreme climate events, or let's say infrastructure is shifting in ways that are difficult to keep up with. Have the gamers think about what they would do and what others would do and game it out. And that's where my sort of interests wound up intersecting.
That makes a ton of sense, and I want to get to the future. But just before we leave games, I'm curious, how you think about where you start when you make a game. How you think about what makes a good game, and do you see some continuum from do we think about video games the same way we think about chess, the same way we think about you mentioned golf? Do all of these somehow do the same thing, or is there is there better and worse in this?
Oh, well, I mean, there's many different kinds of good that you can find in games. Chess is a great example because it really helps us develop a kind of empathy called perspective taking, where you're constantly trying to put yourself in the mind of the other player. What information does she have? What is she likely to do next? What does she think I know? What does she think I'm thinking? And this ability to put yourself essentially in someone else's brain and actually develops a kind of neurological mirroring effect where you are able to simulate someone else's mind in your own mind, like a game like chess. You don't need a video game to do that. You could get that from, a classical board game. But then you look at things like collective intelligence. And one of my favorite phenomena in gaming is when a new video game comes out and basically no one's ever played it before. And suddenly you've got millions of people, 1 in 4 passionate gamers take off from work or school the day a new game drops, and that they're really excited about. And then they're all swarming this game to apply their own expectations and creativity and how does it work. My own experience when the game Pokemon Go dropped 5 years ago, and people were like, what are we supposed to do? How does this work? They didn't give any tutorial. There's no orientation. It's almost like a scientific process on speed, and that ability to drop into that kind of learning and discovery culture, participate in the wikis, and people are streaming on Twitch and everybody's learning in real time, and you level up your knowledge about a topic that chess, it took hundreds of years to level up our global knowledge about how to play this game. Now a video game drops and we develop this incredible collective intelligence about it in days. For me, that is, I always point people to that experience. If you haven't experienced that, being a part of that collective discovery in the moment a new game exists and nobody knows what to do with it, there's so many experiences of awe and wonder and curiosity. And so for folks who love sports or love board games or poker, whatever it is, you should give yourself that experience at least once of trying to drop into the discovery process. It's almost like we've seen those amazing photographs of deep space billions of years ago come out, released by NASA this week, and we're like, what is it? I mean, we can get those same feelings of awe and wonder as we work through a game and develop our confidence that we can be a part of discovery and investigation. And that's something that I think if we all had that sense in our lives, in our work, in our learning, that would be a big boost to our, planet's ability to investigate and solve new problems.
Right. So before we turn to future and future simulation, I do want to remind everybody to submit. We are going to have a time for questions at the end, so please submit your questions. That's your PSA. So you talk about games as sort of creating this toolkit, right? And it's this very specific toolkit that dovetails into that. You realize that the people who did this maybe because they loved it and they were excited about it, not to build a skill set, end up having this skill set that's incredibly applicable for problem solving and for future forecasting, because Maybe it's their own sense of personal agency. Maybe it's the how you think about the world being different. And in your new book, you talk about episodic future thinking as one of these key tools, EFT. So could you explain a little about EFT and what it is? I mean, let's I guess start there, and then how it's used for thinking about the future.
Oh, good. I'm so glad you asked that question because it's such a foundational idea. And oftentimes when talking about this book, we kind of skip right past it. So episodic future thinking is a scientific term for what we might just ordinarily call mental time travel. So it's the experience of projecting ourselves forward in time, really trying to vividly imagine what we might feel and do in a hypothetical scenario as vividly as if it were already a memory from the past that we were able to recall. So it's like a movie in our mind or like a VR world in our mind. And I often liken it to essentially going to a new video game space, a new virtual world. You're really trying to look around. What do I see? Who else is here? What are the opportunities? What are the risks or dangers? What actions can I take? What resources do I need? We're really trying to figure out what we would do in these hypothetical scenarios. And it's very different from how we are often taught to think about the future, especially when it comes to challenges. We're often given very abstract information. So thinking about climate change or climate adaptation, we'll see facts about the future. Well, sea levels might rise. There might be this many more days of extreme heat or wildfire risk, but it's very abstract and it's very hard to imagine, well, how would this affect me? How do I feel about it? What do I want to do about it? So what I teach people to do is to transform the abstract facts about possible futures or these abstract hypotheticals into worlds that we can visit in our mind so that we can get past essentially our psychological blocks about, either it's hard to imagine because we've never experienced it before, or we don't want to think about it because it just sounds like, I don't know, too hard to think about that. I don't like, but we put our mental blinders on. It's a skill that the more you practice it, it really does become a kind of essential tool, not only for preparing for hard to prepare for futures, but just in general, learning to control your attention. So people who often take mental time trips to different futures, where I might say as simply as, imagine yourself meeting somebody for lunch 10 years from today. Who might you be meeting? Where would you meet? How are you different in 10 years? How is the person you're meeting different, physically, psychologically? Yeah. What are you eating that might not exist today? Maybe you're eating lab cultured meat is more common, or whatever, whatever you try to picture those details. The more you practice these simple mental time trips, you get better at controlling your attention when you are stressed, when you're anxious, when you're depressed. It essentially gives you a psychological tool as well as just future readiness, where you can choose to essentially interrupt a negative ruminating thought cycle or an anxious imagination cycle. And you can fill in your imagination with futures that will motivate you or prepare you or kind of pre-fill you with the positive emotions that will help you stay the course with difficult work that you're doing. So it's both effective for preparing for challenging futures, but also just as a tool to improve our psychological well-being, our mental health today.
You spoke a little bit, and I just want to touch on briefly, but about the spectrum between, anxiety and depression as being, two polar kind of ways. I mean, which I think people run together a lot, but actually two totally separate ways of dealing with, future. And can you talk about, how you see the difference between those two, and also sort of how EFT helps navigate you through both?
Yes. So when you are experiencing depression, your brain essentially stops being able to fill in the details of the future. So your ability to actually conjure mental images or detailed descriptions of things you might experience, it powers down to an incredible level where you'll ask them, well, tell me about something you might do next weekend. And it's so vague. Scientists count the number of details in descriptions, and compared to somebody who's not experiencing the depression, they might have half or a quarter of the details that somebody not experiencing depression can conjure. And this is a problem because one of the things that essentially kickstarts our dopamine systems is our brain's ability to imagine something we want, whether it's just out of reach physically or it's just ahead later today, tomorrow, next week. The more vividly we can imagine something we want, then we get that dopamine hit, which helps us pay attention. It helps us with physical energy, with mental energy, with the emotional drive to get out of bed every day. So literally when you're experiencing depression, it's like instead you're seeing this blank slate. And so you don't get the dopamine, you don't get those drive systems kicking in. And it turns out that by teaching people episodic future thinking skills, clinicians have been able to repair that deficit. So you may not naturally be imagining things in detail that will help reignite those dopamine systems that help you feel engaged with the world. But if you tackle it, as an intentional quest that you set for yourself, and this is something that we teach people to do in the Super Better app, because that's often used not just for depression, but people with concussion or traumatic brain injury. And that's even more intense. So you literally cannot imagine the future when you're healing. So we teach people those techniques to essentially fill in the blank slate so we can remotivate. Anxiety, as you said, it's on the other end of the spectrum. With anxiety, you are so good at filling in the vivid details. You are hyper imagining, but it's bad stuff. You are hyper imagining in the most vivid, realistic detail, all of the terrible things that could happen. And sometimes that's useful if you're using that imagination to prepare or change your actions. But if you're committed to a course, you're going to have to do this thing, whether you like it or not, whether you're anxious about it or not, then we have to find ways to interrupt that negative cycle. It's actually also true for people experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder who have flashbacks, unwanted visual imagination of things they've experienced. With both PTSD and anxiety, same episodic future thinking skills to focus, here's what I want to imagine right now. And you change the details of the scene. In episodic future thinking, we're always playing with the details of the scenario. Oh, who else might you be having lunch with? Where else? How would the weather change? How would your body change? And we play with having agency over changing, tweaking all of those details so that now we're in control of our imagination. And that too has been shown to significantly reduce symptoms of anxiety and flashbacks and post-traumatic stress disorders.
And so one more question on EFT. I mean, incredibly powerful. Is it important that EFT is something you do with your imagination? Is that critical to what it is? Or, are there substitutes for it? People often think about reading science fiction as a way to participate in the future, or to update it for for our current moment, the metaverse, right? Or is it sort of fundamental to EFT that it is an act of imagination, that it is a process of you and your brain and yourself going through it?
I think the active imagination is key. If you wanted to write science fiction and design your own alternate reality, then you would actually be practicing a lot of the same skills. If you wanted to create a world in the metaverse, right? And you're consciously deciding what happens here and what are people tackling, what challenges or what opportunities. It is a kind of creative agency, right? Because what we're doing is we're teaching our brain to change what we imagine is possible. And that it's not just about controlling the attention, it is that sense of agency, right? Because any change we want to make in our own lives, in our communities, in our industries, in society, we have to feel the agency to take that action, which is also, an important part of overcoming depression or anxiety, right? It's to feel that agency. So the creative agency is key. What I often find people find easiest to do is a kind of a hybrid, right? It's why I have a scenario club at the Institute for the Future. You come once a month. I have created the future scenario for you. You don't have to conjure it from scratch. But what you do is then you you write almost like a journal entry from this future, where now you fuse my future scenario with your values, with your hopes, your worries, the topics you care about, the skills that you might bring to this future. And so you might be writing about it or just talking with other people about it. That is bringing your agency to this future, and you're creating your ideas about what you would need or want or do. And so passive consumption of ideas about the future will not achieve the same effects as mental time travel, where you're co-creating that that world. Yeah,
that makes sense. And you mentioned lunch in 10 years as a, or maybe having this conversation in 10 years, and how would we be different? But your work often comes back to this 10-year time frame, which is something we wrestle with a ton, I think, in what we do, in our businesses about, if you were too long term, right, things are maybe become nearly impossible to predict, or too many variables. If you're too short term, you don't get far enough away from the present. So why did you settle on 10 years as this interesting moment? So,
yes, well, and I will say, I don't want to take credit for pioneering the 10-year timeline. It was actually one of the first things I learned when I started training as a futurist. All of the research projects around me were looking 10 years out, and the flagship research product at the Institute for the Future is the 10-year forecast. And everybody seemed, in the whole field, seemed to be functioning at this timeline. And I actually became curious to understand, well, people are naturally gravitating towards this timeline as a tool for more creative and innovative and empowered thinking. But why is it? So then that became a kind of research, my new sort of scientific obsession. And so I did discover a few things that has been documented in the neuroscience literature, it's psychological literature, the literature on creativity and innovation. So one thing that's really important about the 10-year timeline comes back to that sense of agency, right? So we say that, futures thinking and future imagination, it's really about thinking how the future could be different, because it's easy to prepare for futures that are continuations of the normal, that are similar to today. We're really trying to think about the ways the future could be different, that would be disruptive and hard to adapt to. So we want to give ourselves enough time to prepare. Like, if the whole world's going to change tomorrow, well, we're all going to essentially be in a state of crisis then. But if we're thinking about the types of disruption that might emerge 10 years out, now you're more in the driver's seat. You have this incredible time spaciousness to think through strategy and to learn more and to prototype ideas or build a movement or find allies, So we do try to find the problems that are on that timeline just at that 10 years out, so that we actually have a realistic chance of readying ourselves or mitigating the risks, or otherwise transforming the challenge, or getting ready for some breakthrough technology, right? And historically, you can see that when it comes to things like technologies or social movements and the disruptions that they create, they often play out at a 10-year timeline. So I've documented, from the very first iPhone to the majority of people on the planet having a smartphone. That was a 10-year timeline. From the first scientific article about cryptocurrency, and it was just this hypothetical idea, to Bitcoin having $1 trillion, market cap. That was a 10-year period. Even social movements like the first protest for racial civil rights in the US, it took 10 years from that first major protest to actually pass the legislation, the Civil Rights Act. So for social change and technological change, 10 years, it's just such like a juicy amount of time where we can give ourselves permission to imagine true disruption or true positive transformation. And besides just that sort of historical record, neurologically, it turns out that people's brains become more open to new ideas, more open to considering information that runs counter to their previous experience or sort of the facts that they have seen on the ground, when they are imagining further out in time. So if you ask somebody to imagine how might things be different, a year from now, or 3, or even 5 or 7, there's often a kind of premature foreclosing of possibility, where we dismiss things. We actually have a normalcy bias where we tend to underestimate the actual risk of change happening. But when people imagine at the 10-year timeline, all of that shifts, and the brain goes from this sort of pattern recognition state where it just wants what has happened, what is true, let me look for patterns from the past, into this default mode, which is where imagination happens. Default mode is the mode that conjures new ideas, that says maybe something is possible that has never been possible before. Now, some people can shift to that earlier, especially if they're trained futurists. They get better at accepting things could change dramatically. Maybe after the pandemic, we'll all be able to do that a little bit better. But if you want a sort of even playing field where every brain in the room will shift to that default mode, 10 years is the timeline to do it at.
It's interesting. And one of the most fascinating ideas that I hadn't heard before, but which seems like the opposite of this normalcy bias, the future is going to look like the past, was this idea that you mentioned of data. Am I saying that correctly?
Datter's law.
Datter's law. And can you talk a little bit about that? About just things are interesting if they're surprising or ridiculous.
So Jim Datter is one of the founding thinkers in the field of foresight studies, future studies. And he established what people refer to as Datter's law, or sometimes it's just called the first law of futurist thinking. And it says, any useful idea about the future should at first seem ridiculous. And it's kind of like a 1-2 gut punch to our normalcy bias, right? So the first aspect is we have to be willing to consider things that seem ridiculous to us, because those are the changes, the disruptions, the possibilities that will be most difficult to adapt to, right? Because they seem so ridiculous, they run so counter to our normal ways of doing things or thinking and behaving, that's where the utility of futurist thinking comes. Because again, if the future is like totally normal sounding, great, we're ready, we don't need, that's solved for. We'll be fine in that case. The thing that we need to apply our imagination to are the things that are going to cause us trouble, that really trip us up. So it will be things that sound weird to us that we would dismiss as saying that could never happen, we don't need to think about it. In fact, those are the things that we benefit from thinking about, because those are the things that we would actually need time to pre-feel and pre-imagine and pre-strategize about. But the thing that is so important about Datter's law is that at first clause, right, they should seem ridiculous at first. But what we find in futures thinking is that when you're conjuring up all the ways the world could be different, the positive transformations, the disruptions, what you need to do is gut check and reality check those ideas against what's happening today. So we teach people to look essentially for the signals of change and the drivers of change that would make these future possibilities more or less likely, which puts us in a position then, as the years go by, to really understand better. Is this possibility becoming more or less likely, more or less significant, or even to figure out, what could I do to make this future happen faster or to help avoid this future? So the ideas might seem ridiculous at first, and I'll give you a concrete example. And then we want to look for evidence. Maybe it's not so ridiculous. So I was recently doing a future imagination workshop with some elected officials in the state of California. And we were thinking about the future of voting rights, the future of democracy. And we were considering what are some of the most ridiculous at first ideas that we might want to prepare our minds for. And one technique we use for that is just to make a list of things that are true today, and then basically flip them upside down, rewrite them so that the opposite is true, or so that a radical alternative is true. And then we go look in scientific journals, in, at think tank papers, on social media, in the news, for evidence that these upside down futures are actually, people are trying to make them, or they're already underway. So with this group, one of the facts of today is that in California, there's a minimum voting age, right? You have to be 18 to vote. So we just flip that, no minimum voting age, or babies can vote, right? Well, if you start going, you can literally just go to Google and start typing these upside down facts, babies can vote. What we discovered is there is a significant movement to dramatically lower voting age in many democracies. More than half of the states in the United States have bills underway to lower it to 16, to 14, as young as 6 or 7. And even some people are saying babies can vote. And there's fascinating reasons for why that is. It has to do with the mental health of young people, helping them feel less depressed and overwhelmed and more engaged. It has to do with, a philosophy of democracy, that younger people have longer to live with the consequences of elections. So they're the most important people not to disenfranchise. And this was a real wake-up call, right? Like, if you're not aware of, growing movements and weird policy ideas that seem weird today, but tomorrow they might be mainstream. And you can do this with technology. You can do it with business models. So we have to be willing to consider ridiculous at first ideas, but then, go do our due diligence and find out, are they more or less ridiculous, right, than they might seem at face? And when you find evidence that people are working to make a particular future, and then now that becomes something that you might want to track or imagine more seriously.
Makes sense. But I think there's this other, really interesting idea in here, which is that, being right, when we talk about the future, most people think about just being right. That I predicted something and it came to pass. And certainly that's in some sense the goal. If that weren't the North Star, it would be hard to have any framework. But it feels like there's something in this idea of Datter's law, and that the very, and in EFT in general, that the very exercise of doing this is valuable, even if we're imagining we end up with a set of possible worlds that never come to pass, because that's a very high bar over 10 years or 20 years.
Yes. So I would say the most practical benefit that everyone can experience from episodic futures thinking or playing with these ridiculous at first ideas and scenarios is that it helps us overcome that hardwired normalcy bias. And it does train our brains to be more receptive to evidence of change. And you are correct in saying it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. If I've been imagining, let's say I've been imagining the next big social media network is a neurosensing network. That's something we've done research on. So we're now essentially broadcasting our unfiltered thoughts because we want to be our authentic selves. What are the risks of that? What are the opportunities? How would it be used in learning, in medicine, in at work, in politics? Even if that social media network never exists, the very act of forcing our minds to really seriously consider and imagine scenarios that we've never personally lived through, and adapting our minds. Okay, this is the new reality. What do I need to learn to understand it? What might I need to do, or how might I need to adapt to thrive in it? That practice, sort of thinking through that initial shock, that the fog of uncertainty where we don't understand it, it's actually quite similar to what we were talking about at the top of the hour when the new video game drops and we're like, how does it work? What am I supposed to do? And everybody is required to accept the new reality. This game is our new reality. We got to figure out how it works and what we're going to do to be successful. Playing with these ridiculous at first ideas, these scenarios, it gives us a skillfulness at that when something weird happens that nobody predicted, because that we can't predict it all, we have a facility, we have that flexibility, and that lived, essentially it's like a lived experience. Even though we haven't lived through all these imagined scenarios, we do have that lived experience of having had to adjust our thinking to come up with new, strategies and accept the change. And I think, one thing we saw in this pandemic that really tripped up a lot of communities and organizations and nation states was essentially denying the reality of the changes that were underway or would be required, wanting to refuse to engage with the facts, the changing facts as they were emerging. And so
have to give you a hat tip here. Tell us the story of Superstruct.
Oh yes, well,
because it was well, you'll tell the story, but Jane was thinking about the potentials of a pandemic long before we were all talking about it. So I think it's a fascinating story.
Yeah, thanks. I'll tell a little bit of the story, but jump in anytime to dig deeper on some of the details. So when I first started experimenting with this new genre of gaming, future forecasting games, I was talking to experts, what sort of big future disruptions or crises might we all have to live through? And I was really thinking about, what would be the most beneficial thing for the most people to imagine. So it's these kind of inclusive crises that would affect everyone. And pandemic really kept coming up again and again as, that's the type of future crisis or disruption that could literally affect every human on Earth. And so the thing about being a game designer is you're always trying to create worlds that everybody can play in, right? If I were imagining like a future space exploration crisis, I mean, most people who showed up to that, if you don't work for NASA, what utility is there in that game for you? Or, how could you add anything of value? So people ask me like, why were you thinking about pandemics? Were you just like obsessed with, public health? Really, it was looking for problems that were the most inclusive problem space that no matter who you were, if there's quarantine, if there's social isolation, if there's supply chain disruptions, if you would be affected. And so everybody could play, everybody could come to these games. The first one was called Superstruct. Because we were playing on these 10-year timelines, we ran that game in 2008 and we were imagining the year 2019. And then we did another simulation in 2010 called Evoke, where we were looking at the year 2020. And both of these, centered around a respiratory pandemic that started in China that was causing, global shutdowns and quarantines and supply chain disruptions. And one of the details we had in that scenario was there was misinformation being spread on social media by a conspiracy group called Citizen X, which kind of uncannily turned out to be similar to QAnon in the real 2019 and 2020. But the way that you would play is, we would present this scenario through videos and facts, and we just asked you questions that anybody could answer. So you've been asked to isolate, or you've been exposed, you have to stay at home for 2 weeks. Can you work from home? Under what circumstances would you break the rules, go out anyway? And people were essentially writing journal entries from this future, blog posts. So we had thousands of people over 8 to 10 weeks just continuing to answer these unfolding questions like, oh, supply chains disrupted. You can only get food that was grown or created within 100 miles of where you live. What could you eat? What are you making for dinner if you can only eat what is, you can locally acquire? So they're answering all these questions, thinking about their own jobs, their own families, their own lives. And we were able to see some really interesting trends in that. When the real pandemic happened, I started getting calls from, the World Bank and companies we'd worked with, and they were asking like, was there anything you learned that we should be thinking about? So I actually did a webinar in February 2020 before the shutdowns started here. And we're saying things like, okay, the number one thing people are going to break isolation or quarantine for is church or religious gatherings, followed by weddings and funerals. These are your super spreading events, because that's what people said. They were writing entries about, my daughter's wedding, like exactly, we're going to do it, or, well, I'm a minister and we're going to keep doing this anyway. And so, it turned out that by talking to just real people about their real feelings in a possible crisis, their real needs and values, we were able to anticipate things that seemed hard to predict to, experts, how divisive it would be to force churches to shut down. And that really became the seeds of the cultural battle. Why was it that we started fighting and red states, were more resistant than blue states? That one thing where people felt their liberty was infringed upon, and it was so personal and so deeply held as value. Maybe if we had approached that a little bit differently, right? Like, were there ways to avoid the culture war? So we can look at things like that. We had people practice wearing masks. We were like, okay, masking's now required in this scenario. First of all, do you know where to get a mask? Do you know what makes a safe mask? And now go wear it. Like, go wear it to a party, go wear it on the bus. Like, how does it feel? Tell a story about it. And we did definitely hear things that convinced us much earlier than people realize it would be hard to get people to do this consistently. There's a physical stamina involved. You really do, for a lot of people, have to work up that just comfort endurance with this new thing on your face. People felt like they really missed the socialness of seeing faces. And so, that was something also we were thinking about very early in 2020, like, are we going to be able to make this easier, more comfortable, more realistic for people to adopt this behavior?
Well, it was incredibly prescient, which I know is the name of the game, so to speak. But so one, I just want to remind one last time, because we're going to turn to audience Q&A to submit questions. But one last question for you, because is where I started was this idea that at least prior to my expectations when I got involved in your work, I was fascinated and impressed by sort of the power of games to create all of these positive virtues, right? So one, to give us predictive power about things, we may be worried about, whatever they may be, right? Global problems, personal problems. Two, to give us agency and give us the tools to overcome it. And you alluded to this a bit, but it sounded like part of that is that the game is a well-defined space, right? And it becomes a space where failure is okay, and where you can take risks in ways you don't take them in the rest of life. But I know this is a question on many parents' minds, and I know you were the mother of twins, and so I'm sure you think about it too. But at what point does or is there a way to we think about gaming becoming a problem, right? Either an addiction or just more generally, when do we have to kind of snap out of the game and into reality, or is that a false dichotomy and the game is, the game and reality run together? And how for people, a lot of whom are parents on the phone, how should you think about gaming, positive, negative, time, and where it can be beneficial to not just ourselves but our kids.
Yes. This is one of my favorite topics, and I'll try to summarize some of the key points so that they're really practical and actionable for folks. But I love that you use the term false dichotomy. Is it a false dichotomy to say we have to snap out of games and back into reality? So the number one predictor in young people, and actually they were studying people in their 20s as well, so kids, teens, adolescents, young adults, the number one predictor of people who developed what they described in their own words as a pathological relationship to gaming, where they were playing more than they felt was healthy or beneficial to their school, their work, their social lives. The number one predictor of people who developed that pathology was people who saw gaming primarily as an escape from reality, and that it had no meaningful connection to the other aspects of their everyday lives. On the other hand, the number one sort of buffer or protector against developing what we might colloquially call addiction, even though it's not quite the same biological basis of, addicting to drugs.
Yeah.
Is people who were able to talk meaningfully about the skills they were developing in games and the personal strengths, the kind of character strengths, psychological strengths, or personality strengths they were building and developing and celebrating in games as something that was a part of who they inherently were in their whole lives. And it's why I try to use the term whole life rather than real life when I talk to my own kids about games. Well, how could you bring that skill to your whole life, right?
Yeah.
Not just Pokemon Go or not just Minecraft, but all of your life. Because if you can think about games as being a space to develop skills that are in you and abilities and strengths that are in you, then the power is not in the game. The power is in you. If you think that the power is in the game, then you are less likely to look for ways to use those skills to solve your real problems. We see the sort of downward spiral effect where you see the game is the only place you can be happy or the only place you can be successful or connected. And so the more problems you have, the more you play. Now your problems get worse, you play. It's this downward spiral. We see the opposite. It's sort of upward spiral of people who can talk about those skills and strengths as a part of who they are, not what the game is. So I always say to parents, the most practical thing you could do is just have more conversations with your kids, watch them play and validate what you're seeing. Like watch what they're doing. And if it looks hard, tell them that it looks hard and ask them like, how are you doing this? I couldn't do this. Tell me about how you're doing this. Or if they're like working on something that looks frustrating, like, wow, what's your strategy here? How long have you been working on this? Let them talk about those qualities of resilience and determination and, flexible creative thinking, and even asking questions like, what have you gotten better at since you started playing this game? What does it take to be good at this game? Just those simple acts of conversation, and also watching, like, what are you doing in Fortnite or League of Legends or whatever it is? Be amazed, be impressed. Let your kids see the bridge between the game and their whole lives. And don't say things like, do something real. Because if you make the game unreal, they will never bring those strengths to, real problems or real life.
That makes perfect sense. Let me shift to this is really enjoyed this conversation. Let me shift quickly to audience Q&A because I want to get in. We have a lot of questions and I want to get in as many as I can. I know you do a lot of advising for corporations. So one question is understand EFT, the 10-year time frame. How do you see it? How do you see it useful in a corporate context, right? Think of a corporate, complex corporation with constant pressures and constantly changing incentives, and maybe a shorter time frame, in some ways than 10 years. How are these tools useful in that context?
Yeah, so I'll give like 3 really practical, essentially habits that we try to teach organizations to incorporate into their like larger strategic processes or planning processes. So one is just to have a culture of collecting and sharing signals of change. So we mentioned signals of change. These are real things that are happening today that are like little tiny sparks of innovation, or they're early technologies, or promising scientific breakthroughs that don't quite have an application yet. We often suggest building a culture where you kick off meetings at the start of every meeting, a different person shares a signal of change, or you have lunch, Zoom hangouts or coffee hangouts where everybody brings a signal of change and you share and you just talk about them. Like, what could this mean? What might change if this signal became common, widespread, amplified? Having that facility to know, how to find signals of change, how to share them and talk about them can build a really important future literacy that maybe it doesn't take us out 10 years always, but it's helping us look ahead. Where are these signals pointing us, the possibilities? So a signals of change practice is important. A drivers of change practice is important. So drivers of change are the bigger, large scale forces that are likely to affect any future we want to think about. extreme climate events would be an obvious one, affecting, infrastructure, affecting global health, affecting migration, all kinds of things. Have as an organization a set of drivers of change that you're asking everybody to be mindful of, to be learning about, whatever you think that happens to be. So that, again, that builds a foundation of futures thinking across the organization. And then the third one is a kind of simple and silly habit, but I've heard it's really transformative. It's like this sort of 3-question game that you can play, where you ask people to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how they feel about 3 questions. And I'll just tell you 3 questions really quickly. When you think about a particular future topic, so you could do future of our company, future of economic policy, future of food, whatever. How much change do you expect in the next decade? On a scale of 1 to 10. 1 is everything is going to go on as normal. 10 is everything is radically transformed. And you have people share their numbers and why. Where are you on the spectrum? And that's a good way to get some sort of foresight, sharing of different points of views, maybe stretching people to think about change more. The second question is, when you think about the ways this future topic might change, how excited or worried about it are you on a scale of 1 to 10? 1 is extremely worried, 10 is extremely excited or optimistic. You have people share their numbers and why. Oftentimes we'll pair 1s with 10s and 2s with 9s and get a lot of interesting conversation. And the third question is, how much personal power do you feel you have within the organization or within society to affect how this future change unfolds? And 1 is like no power, 10 is I'm the most powerful person in the organization or the world. And using these 3 questions as a way to increase, conversation about the need for mental flexibility, about trying to balance our imagination between, the positive, techno, like everything's gonna be solved, but also the shadow imagination and everything's getting worse, trying to create a balance of that. And then also finding our personal agency. What are the levers that I have, the buttons I can press to help determine change, build agency, even just asking that question. So
there's so much here, and unfortunately we're running out of time. I would really underscore how impressive I found this body of work, and how useful I think this set of tools is, to try to engage in, and frankly fun too. We had a lot of questions about further resources, right? That if people want to pick up these tools and run with them, where to go. I would point you all to Jane's most recent book, Imaginable. But Jane, any other resources that you want to share, or places people can go from here?
So Imaginable's the on-ramp, and then we have a public membership program at the Institute for the Future where you can join Scenario Club and you can participate in these future forecasting games. It's called Urgent Optimists. So there's an app, there's a website, and this is just a good community for practicing futures habits. We have monthly signals of change scavenger hunts. It's really if you want to just be in a community where you can practice these skills, that's a good place to start. And of course, follow the Institute for the Future. We have a newsletter, Signals from the Future. We have, social media, and, maybe there will be opportunities for the Institute for the Future and Standard to work together. Would be amazing.
That would be great. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I really enjoyed the conversation, and it was great. And thanks everybody, on behalf of everybody here. Thank you to Jane for being with us today. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, David.